The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to this webinar on Agile Risk-Based Testing. I'm Rex Black, president of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, RBCS has delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller Managing the Testing Process and 4 books on the ISTQB program. RBCS is presenting this webinar in partnership with software test professionals. Check out their website at www.softwaretestpro.com. And special mention, I was at their conference last week, STPCon in Denver. It was great. Saw some familiar faces there and met some new people. It was very nice. So I hope to see some of you at the upcoming STPCon in San Diego next year. Attendance at today's webinar earns PMI PDUs. I would like to thank Murali Guthula for reviewing the materials for PDU status and, as always, for making very valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim the PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. Before we start the presentation, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions or comments during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them throughout the presentation via your webinar interface, but please note they are answered only at the end. There is no need to ask for presentation copies, though someone surely will, as the presentation is on the web at www.rbcs-us.com. Navigate to the Resources tab in the upper middle, and from there to the Basic Library, and you will find them. By attending this webinar, you were automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing. Check your email over the next couple days and watch that spam filter. Hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. Okay, so today we will be looking at how to apply risk-based testing in Agile life cycles. Something a lot of our clients do is practice risk-based testing, but they often have problems when they've gone to Agile projects with continuing to do that because the order in which things happen gets a little bit modified. But it is actually primarily a sequencing issue, and you can get all of the benefits of risk-based testing throughout the entire test process, from planning and analysis all the way through to execution and results reporting. Just a matter of figuring out how to fit it in the right places in the process. So let me show you how to make this work. Okay, so in this graphic, let me get the spotlight up, and hopefully it will work. Each iteration or sprint would be if you were following the Scrum approach, which a lot of our clients, I'd say most of our clients that are following Agile are following some variant of Scrum. So you got each iteration or sprint shown here, these kind of loopy looking things where the programmer writes code. Code ideally goes through a code review. It goes through a unit test, though sometimes the unit test would precede the code review or be even in parallel with the creation of the code if they're using something like test-driven development. And then there's a feature verification test using something like acceptance test-driven development or behavior-driven development, something to verify that the acceptance criteria are met. And then ultimately there is an acceptance test by the business stakeholder, usually some sort of demo where the business stakeholder sees it work and effectively validates the implementation of the user story being the Agile name for a requirement. And as the code is being built, it's constantly being integrated into the continuous integration framework. Most of our clients are using something like Hudson, or Jenkins, or something along those lines now. Now, the project consists of a sequence of these sprints. The project can basically end at any point. We might decide, okay, we've actually built enough now, we don't need to continue this, we can just deliver it to the customer now. Or some of our clients, they are delivering continuously, and some of our clients are actually doing a mix of delivering at the end of every sprint for some of their stuff, like their web-based stuff, and for other kind of enterprise applications, they go through a number of sprints before they actually push something out into production. So it kind of depends on how the organization wants to do that. Now, in terms of what risk-based testing does here in the life cycle is at the beginning of each sprint, you're going to do a quality risk analysis based on the content of that sprint. So as part of going through the user stories and cleaning up the user stories, refining the user stories for that sprint, prior to doing the estimation, which is something I'll get right back to, we're going to go and do a risk analysis on the content of the sprint, primarily based on the user stories, though it's important to remember that there are some non-functional risks that might be might transcend, as it were, any one user story. Security and performance and reliability can be like this. That there are risks which are more systemic, more emergent from the entire system rather than associated with a single user story. So we're going to do that quality risk analysis during the sprint planning, again, as part of going through the user stories prior to the estimation. And then after the estimation is done and we've decided on what actually is going to be the content of the user story, then we have to design and implement the test to cover the risks, which is typical. I mean, this happens in risk-based testing for traditional sequential lifecycle models as well. The thing that's a little different here is that we're going to need the developers to create the features in the order of risk to the extent that they can. Now, the reason for this is, remember that in risk-based testing, we want to run the higher risk tests first. Well, in a sequential lifecycle model, if we're talking about system tests, since you wait until you're feature complete before you start system test, I can run the tests in whatever order I want as a test manager, and it has nothing to do with the order in which the developers created them. In Agile, since I'm going to start my system testing of the user stories that have been implemented as soon as those are delivered to me in the sprint, then in order to run the tests in risk order, the user stories have to be built in risk order. Now, this isn't as disruptive as it might sound because, of course, the user stories are prioritized, or at least they should be. Best practice is that they would be. And priority is going to influence the order of implementation anyway. And priority is also going to have a strong impact on the impact rating in the risk-based testing analysis and the quality risk analysis. So it's not a dramatic deviation that's being proposed here, but you do have to make sure that the developers are on board to build things in risk order. And then in terms of your automated tests in the continuous integration system, you have to look at risk again to go, okay, well, the level of regression risk associated with a particular item, that's going to mean, that's going to influence how much regression testing automated regression testing I put in the continuous integration framework. So again, there we'll be looking at risk, and one would assume that the depth of testing done by the product owner, other business stakeholder during their acceptance test would also be based on the level of risk. So that's what this looks like, graphically speaking. Testing, as in any life cycle model, it doesn't matter which, we're trying to determine what to test, in what order, and how much, based on the level of risk associated with various attributes of the system. And what this will do is maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of the testing effort with respect to minimizing the residual level of quality risk at the end of testing. I mean, any testing that you do will reduce the level of quality risk, reduce the risk of previously undetected failures in production. But only risk-based testing is actually designed to maximize the amount of risk mitigation that is achieved by testing. Any other technique that is not risk aware will leave a larger amount of residual risk behind. Now, if you're not familiar with risk-based testing at all, then one of the things I would recommend is that you go to the RBCS website, rbcs-us.com, navigate to the resources tab in the upper middle, as I said, and then from there to the digital library. There's a number of videos on risk-based testing that can give you a basic overview in a life cycle independent way of how risk-based testing works. So I'd encourage you to do that, and if this is entirely new to you. Just to give a high-level overview here of risk analysis and risk-based testing, something I can spend and do spend hours and hours on in training courses. Basically, what we can say is that risk is the possibility of a negative or undesirable outcome. It's a bad thing that could happen, and risks have different levels of risk, and the easiest way to think of that is to look at two distinct factors. One is the likelihood of this bad thing happening, and the other is the impact if this bad thing does happen. And I think this is fairly intuitive. We do this in our day-to-day life all the time. Sort of things that are of a certain threshold of likelihood and a certain threshold of impact, then we worry about them. And the higher the likelihood and or impact, the greater the steps that we take to avoid getting into into such a situation, a risky situation. So most people are aware that car accidents can be fairly high impact, but they're relatively low likelihood. So as long as we're cautious when we're driving, then that's the sufficient mitigation. Of course, you don't want to do anything that is going to increase your likelihood of being in a car accident, like driving drunk, or driving at a time of night or during a particular holiday when a lot of people are drunk, like for example driving around at 2 a.m. and on New Year's Eve. Probably not the world's smartest thing to do. So most of the time we take steps to reduce likelihood wherever we can for those things that are going to be a significant impact to us. So again, just pretty much common sense. Now, when I talk about quality risk, quality risk is a potential problem that could occur that would affect the quality of the product. And I'll give you some examples of that on the next slide. A project risk is different. A project risk is a potential problem that would endanger a project's success. Now, generally, the way that you can distinguish between a quality risk and a project risk is to ask yourself whether you could mitigate the risk by running a test prior to release. If you can, then it's quality risk. Quality risks are testable. I can test for performance problems, for example. But project risks, things like somebody being out sick for a substantial period of time, key piece of equipment not showing up on time, so forth. I can't run a test to mitigate that risk. Now, in a traditional lifecycle model, there is going to be one big quality risk analysis up front during the planning process, and the results of that risk analysis, the risk catalog, will be periodically adjusted as new information becomes available, typically at major project milestones. In Agile, that gets turned on its head. So what happens is that during the release planning at the very beginning, then say a tester and maybe just one or two of the developers together with the business stakeholders will sit down and do a very high level analysis of the risks, just again at a high level, very general, the kinds of things that we'd be worried about, just to gain some insights and to position ourselves to do certain kinds of testing that might have longer lead times, such as, say, performance testing or something like that. But the bulk of the risk analysis, the detailed quality risk analysis, is actually going to occur, as I said before, during iteration planning, and it will involve the whole team, including the product owner or other business stakeholders. And that's where we're going to identify the specific risks as opposed to the high-level risks. And then, of course, in that sprint, we'll address those specific risks through the design, implementation, and execution of tests. So let's look at some examples here of what we would be talking about if we were talking about a quality risk. Anything that would affect customer, user, or stakeholder satisfaction can be thought of as a quality risk, assuming that it is a testable attribute of the system. So, an example: system calculates an incorrect total on a year-end sales report. That would be one example of a functional quality risk item. Slow response time during user login. That's a non-functional quality risk, specifically related to performance. User finds the customer login screen confusing. That's also a non-functional quality risk, in this case related to usability. And we can have functional and non-functional quality risks. It's important that you do consider both types. Now, what we're going to do in the risk analysis, we'll identify these specific risk items, and it's typically going to be, 15, 20, 25 risk items in a single sprint. It's very unlikely to be more than that. So we will do more testing for the higher level risks, do less testing for the lower level risks. Again, trying to sequence the development so that we can test the higher level risks earlier and the lower level risks later. And in terms of effort allocation, it's important that when we go through the estimation process that we assign more effort, story points or person hours, however you're doing that as part of your estimation process, to make sure that you're thinking about how much testing effort is involved as part of the release planning. Okay, so in terms of the process, at the beginning of each iteration, you're going to be going through the selected iteration backlog items. And as part of that process, together with the whole team, what we're going to do is identify the functional and non-functional quality risks that are associated with each one of the items. Then, once we have identified the quality risks, we want to go through, and categorize the risks appropriately. What type of risk is it? Usability, performance, reliability, and so forth. Just to think about, okay, what kind of testing is going to be required here? What test type will be necessary? And also, for each risk item, assess the level of risk based on the likelihood and impact. Now, as you do that process, you want to make sure that you avoid clumping of the risk ratings. Now, clumping happens when you have too many items that are receiving the same or similar likelihood and or impact rating. So, for example, if most of the risk items are rated as very high or high impact, then you have clumping. What you want is a fairly even distribution of the risk items across the impact ratings and across the likelihood ratings. And it's easy enough if you use a spreadsheet to look at this in a histogram and see if you have any clumping happening. You want to be careful of that, because if you do have a lot of clumping, then you're not going to get any real good effective prioritization of your tests out of the process. So once you have the likelihood and impact distributions looking good, and many times the pathway to doing that is simply making sure that you have very clear criteria for assignment into particular likelihood and impact ratings, especially with impact, and especially the higher ones. It's very high and high impact. You want to try to be very strict about what gets rated as very high or high impact. Once you have that all determined, then you're going to be able to use the level of risk to figure out what the appropriate extent of testing is. I'm going to come back to that topic here in a little bit. And that's subsequently going to also determine what test techniques you should use to cover each risk item, and that's something else I'm going to come back to. Now, that's something for you in terms of your design and implementation, the extent of testing to pursue, the test techniques to use. Now, there's also another group activity that needs to happen here, which is the estimation part, participating in the estimation. And you're going to use the selected extent of testing to influence how much effort you think is required to test a particular risk item to cover it adequately. So that'll be part of your input into the estimation process. Now, in traditional life cycle models, excuse me, I had to get a little drink of water there. In a traditional life cycle model, we have to plan on fairly significant updates to the risk catalog at major project milestones as the project evolves. Now, since we're doing the risk analysis on an iteration by iteration basis, we're much closer to the work. So the adjustments tend to be a lot less, but nonetheless, it is still possible that you will need to make adjustments as you go. So you should be aware of that possibility and ready for that possibility as you go along, that you might need to make adjustments. Now, something else to be aware of is that just as in a traditional lifecycle model, when you're going through a user story and identifying risks in it, you might very well identify problems in the user story, testability issues, functionality problems, lack of clarity, and so forth. So it should be seen as an opportunity to improve the user stories as well as identifying risks in them. Okay. Now, in this slide, you see a template for capturing risks, and again, I would recommend using a spreadsheet to do this. Let me get over here with the highlighter. So we have a list of 24 quality risk categories. It's available for free download off of the basic library on the RBCS website. And what I would do is encourage you to go to get that list. And when you're going through the risk identification process during iteration planning, then after going through the user stories, make sure that you quickly review the risks in that checklist, or excuse me, the risk categories in that checklist to make sure that you haven't left anything out. It's quite possible that you could omit something. And thing with user stories is that in spite of I don't know, the ambitions of some people to capture non-functional elements in a user story, what we're seeing with our clients is that for the most part the user stories are describing functional behavior. Now, in some cases, it's pretty straightforward to see non-functional risk items associated with a specific user story, but in other cases, it's not. So, it's evidence of this. I guess if I say inherent weakness in Agile, I'll get the dogmatist stirred up. But I do think that this is a risk that's inherent in the use of user stories as a way of capturing requirements. Because of that, the rollout of the healthcare.gov here in the United States was very problematic in terms of things like interoperability and performance and security, because they used Agile methods to develop that system, and the functionality was apparently there. What was behind it wasn't so good because it didn't communicate well with other things, and also it had significant performance and security problems. So just be careful when you're doing the risk analysis. Don't just confine yourself to the user stories. Make sure that you go through this checklist as well, and be careful not to forget any non-functional kinds of risks. So you go through, you identify the risks. That's the first pass. And then having done that, you're going to go back and assess the likelihood and the impact associated with each risk. Now, likelihood, this is the likelihood that a bug might exist in the software when it's delivered to you for testing. It's basically a measure of the level of technical risk, because likelihood is, it has to do with how the system is built. Impact is, how bad would it be if we released something with a bug in this area and it affected our customers, users, or other stakeholders. So that's primarily from a business perspective, that rating. Some of our clients actually, they delegate the rating of likelihood to their most senior developer and delegate the rating of impact to a product owner. We have one client that's doing Agile risk-based testing, and that's the approach that they're using. So that is something you can do, or you can just have it be part of this group activity. I think in Agile, probably makes more sense to have it be part of this group activity, as long as you can, as long as you're careful to manage the time that's associated with doing it. Now, as you can see, I've have a suggested scale here from very high to very low. I'm using a descending scale, which is as the number goes down, or as the number goes up, the risk goes down. Likelihood and impact, that is, as well as the aggregate measure of risk. If you don't like that, if you prefer to use an ascending scale where the higher number, 5, means the highest level of likelihood and or impact, then feel free to do that. Just, you can do it either way. I use the descending scale just because it's very similar to typical bug tracking systems, that severity 1 is the most important bug and severity 5 is least important bugs. But use whichever approach, ascending or descending, that you like. Now, what is very important is that you have, as I said before, clearly defined criteria that have to be satisfied for a risk item to fit into a particular likelihood and impact rating. It's especially important for impact. Likelihood is a little more straightforward because something that's very high likelihood, is clearly something that's almost certain to happen, right? Versus high likelihood, where it's like, well, it's more likely to happen than not to happen. Medium likelihood is, well, it might happen, it might not happen. It's about 50-50. Low likelihood is, it's more likely not to happen than to happen. And very low likelihood is it's almost certain not to happen. That's pretty straightforward. People internalize that pretty quickly. But impact is a little harder. And I've done exercises with people around the world on this, and worked with clients around the world on this, and everybody always struggles with, how do I assign impact? And the key to it is come up with a set of criteria that are clearly defined, that everybody can understand, that are, fairly simple. You want this not to be too convoluted, and, not trying to replicate the U.S. tax code or anything like that with this. So you want to keep it down to 3, maybe 4 criteria per level, and then people just look at it and go, yeah, okay, it meets that one, so it goes in here. If you can get these criteria right, the impact ratings will be pretty straightforward. If you don't get the criteria right, this is going to be a constant source of struggle, and worse yet, you're not going to achieve the kind of benefits out of this technique that you really want. Now, having rated the likelihood and the impact, we can then come up with the risk priority number, which is the way I do this is I like to keep things simple. I just multiply the likelihood times the impact. So if I have a likelihood of 1 and an impact of 1, the risk priority number is 1. Likelihood of 3 and an impact of 2, then the risk priority number is 6, and so forth. Obviously, if I set this up in a spreadsheet, this can all be happening completely automatically. Then next, I select the extent of testing. Now, what I've shown here is that if the risk priority number is from 1 to 5, I'm going to do extensive testing. If it's from 6 to 10, I'm going to do broad testing. 11 to 15 will be cursory testing. 16 to 20 will be opportunistic testing, and 21 to 25 will be no testing, but I will report bugs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the extensive testing and what those mean here in a moment. So hold your thoughts and questions on that. I'll explain this further. The important thing to keep in mind about these extensive testing categories here, the five levels that I've shown, is that this still leaves a lot to the judgment of the tester. It's not like a magic formula that you're going to be able to crank out, so this risk priority number equals this number of person hours, or this, this number of test cases. That's not something you're going to be able to do. I don't think it would make a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, if you had developed a bunch of tests for a bunch of risk items, and you did a scatter plot, looking at the number of tests per risk item based on the risk priority number of the risk item, you would see correlation there. But I don't think it would be like a nice straight line, showing perfect correlation. I don't think it makes sense to do that. It's more of a matter of guidance. And then finally, this tracing column here, you would just capture the user story identifier. That way, if the user story is modified at some point during the course of the sprint, new acceptance criteria are defined for it, what have you, you can go back and look at the risks that are related to it and see if any of those risks need to be expanded upon. Okay, so as a template for capturing it, so you're going to estimate, as I said, as part of iteration planning. So the risk level is one of the things you're going to look at when you're trying to think of what's the story size from a testing point of view. And you also want to think about complexity. Some things are just inherently harder to test because they're more complex. There's also uncertainty that needs to be considered because if you're not clear on how you're going to test something, obviously you want to rate that as higher. In techniques like planning poker, you'll sometimes hear this phrase "throwing the king" to mean that this is sufficiently complex, uncertain, et cetera, that I can't estimate it. It's too big to estimate. It needs to be broken down further. Your risk analysis would then be a feed into the estimation process. Again, you use a technique like planning poker. That will work fine. You're going to need to be ready to explain, okay, this kind of risk item at this level of risk, this is how we have to go about testing it, so this is why it's going to take as long as I think it's going to take. Expect that you can get some amount of pushback if you say that something is going to take a lot of effort. Now, it is important that estimation be done in a reliable fashion. One of the things that you want to have in Agile is a well-established velocity for the team. In other words, how much work can the team get done in a given sprint, so that you're not like continually overcommitting and basically failing to deliver things. And that's because that's back to the bad old days of what people always complain about with the V model and then the sequential model is that, it's always, 20 pounds in a 10-pound bucket, and you get to the end of the project and it's not done, So you certainly don't want to replicate that in Agile, which means that you have to know, how much work can we get done in a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week sprint, what actually does constitute a particular size of work. So, yeah, it's important that this be done, carefully and seriously. Now let's look at the different extents of testing here, extent of testing ratings or levels, from extensive to broad to cursory to opportunity to report bugs only. Basically, if extensive, it is what it sounds like. You're going to run a lot of tests. You're going to test broad across the breadth of the user story, as well as deep. You're going to do combinational types of testing. You're going to go out and you're going to look at relevant techniques and apply them with very strong coverage criteria. Now, if you haven't seen this already, and I would guess that most of you haven't, there is a article on the RBCS articles page. So if you go out to the articles page, you can find this. Pretty short. It's like three pages. It's actually it's a former blog post converted into an article, which in turn is part of a book that I wrote, Advanced Software Testing Volume 2. Volume 2. That will give you guidance on suggested techniques to match up with these particular extensive testing. So I'd suggest that you go out and look at that. I'm just covering this kind of at a higher level here on this slide, but there's a lot more depth about what I mean by use all relevant techniques with strong coverage criteria, for example. So broad testing is, I'm not going to run a lot of tests. It's going to be kind of a medium level of tests. I'm going to make sure that I've identified a lot of different interesting conditions. I'm going to apply the relevant test design techniques, but I'm not going to be very strict about coverage. Cursory is, I'm just going to test the most interesting things. I'm going to use various test design techniques, but, I'm going to be pretty relaxed about what it would mean to cover them. Opportunity is, I'm not going to create any tests specifically for this risk item, but I am, if I get a chance to test this as part of testing something else, I will do that. Exploratory testing, for example, is a good fit for this. And then report bugs only is, I'm going to say, I'm not actually going to do any testing for this at all, but if I happen to see a bug related to this risk item, I will spend the time to report it. Now, the relative distributions of these, I showed on the previous slide, even distribution, and 1 through 5 was extensive, and 6 through 10 was broad, and so forth. You don't have to do it that way. You can make those distributions however you want, whatever is going to fit for your product. If you're dealing with something that's much more, and quality is very important, you might have you might only have extensive, broad, and cursory as the 3 levels of risk that you use. And every risk item is going to get tested. It's just a matter of to what extent. If something's seen as generally low risk and it's like, well, look, we just need to get a lot of features out as quickly as possible, there may be very little extensive testing, maybe fairly limited amount of broad testing, and mostly cursory and opportunity testing with some amount of reporting bugs only. So, it's completely up to you as to how to kind of tweak that distribution to fit what you want. Now, in terms of that template that we were looking at, I mentioned that this spreadsheet is a good way of doing that. There are out on the RBCS basic library a couple examples of spreadsheets used for risk analysis. So, feel free to download those and use those as well. Okay, so again, this risk identification needs to be part of this whole collaborative process of user story creation. So when we're doing the risk identification, we're looking at the user stories. It may very well be modifying them, clarifying them, defining acceptance criteria for those. So this process of identification of the risk item should be integrated into that process of creating and refining the user stories for a particular iteration. Particularly important is to talk about the confirmation process of how you're going to check the acceptance criteria during this risk analysis process that you're going through. Obviously to make it clear what it would mean for this to be done is essential to really uncovering all of the risks that you're going to need to explore as part of doing the testing. And it's also important that you deal with any sort of testability issues that are associated with a particular user story. So a testability issue, an example of that would be, there might be a couple different ways to implement a user story, and one of them inherently creates a whole lot more potential invalid inputs that would have to be tested. As an example of that, suppose that you were testing something like Microsoft Outlook and specifically looking at the task and appointment creation. Now, if you're familiar with that feature, not only can you select dates and times off of pull-down menus, but you can also edit them directly. Now, that means that you have to test both different ways of entering a date, and there's a whole lot of negative testing that has to be done for the manual entry that is completely unnecessary for the pull-down list. If you can't, if a date doesn't exist, like the 31st of February, it's not going to be on the pull-down calendar, and thus you can't select it. So, that makes an Outlook inherently less testable than, say, the GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar interface that we use for this particular presentation. When I was setting up some webinars for the spring yesterday, I went to enter dates and times. You can't edit those directly. Those are selected off of a pull-down menu, which is a calendar, and the only things that you see are valid dates. So the Citrix interface is inherently, the Citrix GoToWebinar interface is inherently a lot more testable, and then it's easier to test than the Microsoft Outlook interface. So, have that conversation, because that's important too from a how much risk mitigation can we actually accomplish perspective. So again, look at the acceptance criteria, look at the risks that are associated with particular acceptance criteria. See here it says, okay, current and previous versions of four different browsers. No horizontal scrolling required. So, it's pretty clear there. You go, okay, well, I've got specific tests that I have to do. There's basically eight supported browsers. There's four different specific browsers, but two versions of each one. And I also have to make sure that I look at the horizontal scrolling. If there's anything that's unclear in terms of the acceptance criteria and the quality risks that would be associated with that, then again, you just need to go, okay, we need to talk about this a little further. Now, in a lot of our clients that are doing Agile, following a model that looks like what you see here on this slide, which is that, let me get the spotlight up. You have testers, individual testers, who are assigned to work as part of a specific Scrum team, and so they're embedded within the team. And you have other testers who are doing supporting roles like automation and test data and test environments and so forth, and are not specifically within the team. And we have a test manager managing this whole group. Now, this can be kind of a transition role-wise, because in traditional lifecycle models, the risk analysis and the test planning is going to be driven by the test manager. If there's a tester, an individual contributor involved in the risk analysis, it's going to be a very senior one. Now, each individual tester here is going to have to be ready to drive the risk analysis, quality risk analysis within their own teams, possibly supported by the test manager, but for the most part on their own. So this is important. If you are a test manager, you're transitioning into Agile, you're currently using risk-based testing, you want to make sure that you continue to do that. If you've been traditionally the one who's been handling the quality risk analysis, you're going to need to ramp up your people. You're going to need to get them up to speed on how this process works. So, probably the way to do that is to support them initially by being present during that process for each person and coaching them, getting them some training, either actual formal training or making sure they go through some of the resources that are available on the RBCS website, for example, at the very least, so that they can actually do this, carry this out. Because otherwise, what's likely to happen is that they're just simply not going to know how to do it, and the process is going to wither and die. Now, change does happen. This is part of this sort of an essential aspect of agile development, and so when things change, keep in mind that will affect your risk analysis. That will affect your current test results. Be ready to go back and look at your risk analysis, update your risk analysis if there is a change to a user story, or if there's a new user story that gets dropped in the middle of a sprint. I know that according to Scrum theory, these things aren't supposed to happen, that once the content of a sprint is decided, that should not change. But, for pretty much every client that I've worked with that's doing Agile, change does happen during the sprints, and you have to be ready to deal with it, and make sure that you're set up to report your results in a way which is flexible enough that it's, when the change happens, it's not a big disaster to you in terms of your results reporting. This is one of the challenges that our clients that are trying to use the more traditional type of test management tools like Rational Test Manager or Quality Center, or those kind of things, are running into when they try to transition to Agile, is that they find out, it's the tools were sort of designed on a basic assumption that plans would be established at the beginning, the test basis would be established at the beginning of the project, and that's that, and so, if you are using one of the more traditional test management tools for results capture and results reporting, just think through this issue of how do we set this up and how do we capture information in a way that's change resistant. Make sure that part of your results reporting does include capturing the status of the risk items. One of the things that you might do is figure out a way of taking that risk catalog that we put together at the beginning of the iteration and categorizing each risk item as your tests go, as your test execution goes. Basically, what I would suggest is that each risk item should be categorized as green, red, or black. Green means that for this risk item, all of the associated tests have been run and they all pass, so this risk is fully mitigated. Red would mean some or all of the tests for this risk item have been run, and at least one of those tests is currently failing, or there was a bug found that is associated with this risk item via something like exploratory testing. So this is a risk with known problems. And then black is basically a risk that is neither red nor green. So some or none of the tests have been run. At this point, none of the tests have failed, and there are no known bugs, but we're still in the dark about this, hence black classification. We haven't finished testing it yet. So, there are ways of making that pretty easily visible. You could have just a simple whiteboard that had 3 columns, that had black, red, and green, and the risk items are stuck up there in the appropriate column, and you're not done until all of the risk items are in the green column. And this is something that could be done as a way of augmenting the task boards in the daily stand-up meetings. Basically, that's going to provide a little additional detail underneath the testing status. So if we look at the task board here, example task board, Yeah, as user stories, the US there, as those move into the verify column, we're going to find bugs with them. There might be associated tasks that get spawned out of that. So let me get the highlighter up here. The test results here would be where you would actually have a finer grain breakdown for the status of these different verifies. Like, again, the user stories, what is the user story? Can also be classified as red, green, red, or black, using the same kind of criteria I was just discussing. The risks, bugs can be shown as, whether they're active or not. So having a separate way of displaying your test results is a good practice in Agile, because the problem with these task boards is that they're really pretty opaque when it comes to what the status of testing is. And if you look at the agenda, again, in Agile here, your agenda for the daily stand-up meetings is just, what have you done since the last meeting? What do you plan to complete by the next one? What's getting in your way? That's purely tactical in terms of how do we get to done, right? But you actually also want to discuss as a tester, well, what's the status of my testing? So you need an additional item on your agenda that basically says, what's the test status? So you want to incorporate that here so that you're able to provide some detail in terms of the test results. Okay, so conclude here. Risk-based testing is a long-proven testing best practice. This is something that I've been working on, helping clients do, and using myself for, closing in on 20 years now. When I first got started doing it, it was kind of outlandish, I guess, and we were using techniques that were pretty heavyweight, borrowed from manufacturing. Just like, a lot of people are trying to do with Agile now, borrowing lean ideas. We borrowed things like failure mode and effect analysis. But we've really gotten it tightened up a lot now, and it's, nice, lightweight, but effective techniques. There are a number of things that are important about risk-based testing, and the two that are most important, one is engagement of the stakeholders, which fortunately in Agile you're supposed to have that in the stakeholder engagement. Another thing that's very important is properly integrating the risk-based testing activities into the life cycle. And that is something that a lot of our clients have struggled with. Hopefully this is giving you some ideas on how to do that. Keep in mind that, as I've mentioned throughout here, that the quality risk analysis iterates. It happens at the beginning of each iteration. It is adjusted during the iterations. You want to make sure that you don't just use this to think out how much testing to do, but also, again, the design, the execution, and the results reporting should all be risk aware. It is possible, as I've discussed, to integrate this into other traditional or other particular Agile techniques, planning poker, for example, and the use of this in estimation, augmenting the task board to have an additional test results board. Risk-based testing implemented properly is very consistent with the whole Agile approach. It is going to get your focus in the right place, and ultimately make your testing more Agile in a way that complements the agility of the software development. So with that all said, let's go to Q&A here. Let's see. I had a question here at the beginning. This is worth just mentioning, and this comes up via email too. But somebody asked about when is the webinar due to start, and they gave their local time zone. There are a lot of time zones in the world. We do this webinar for free, and we're happy to provide this as a free service. But there are plenty of free resources on the internet that will convert time zones for you. So when the webinar says when the webinar invitation says that it starts at 1 p.m. Central Time in the United States, we're in the United States, you're going to need to take the initiative to figure out what that means in terms of your local time, because it's just not something that we're going to be able to do is tell the hundreds of attendees, okay, so in your local time it starts here, and in your local time it starts here. So please go use some of those universal time and date converters that are out there on the internet. There are a number of them, just convert it yourself. Now, theoretically, when you get the invite, if you add the invite to your Outlook calendar, it should convert that for you. I have had situations, particularly right around, when daylight savings time is about to change, where that got screwed up. So apologies if that happens, but that's a Microsoft bug, which can and does occur. Somebody asked how we track who is participating, and that's something that Citrix does. So if you are here participating, then we'll get a report that shows that you were. Now, I should point out there is still a bug with that. If you participate using a tablet or other mobile device, you can participate, but unfortunately you don't get shown as an attendee. So that can create some problems. So if you need PDUs, you need to make sure that you attend via a regular PC. Apologies for that. If you want to see that bug get fixed, which we certainly would like to see that bug get fixed, please contact Citrix. Now, I've got a comment here specific to slide 3. So let's go, whoops. Let's go back to slide 3. Okay, that doesn't work. Let's do it here. Oops. Okay, so comment is from Bill. Good to see you back, Bill. Comment on third slide. Order of feature creation is influenced by level of risk. Yes. Sometimes the level of project risk and quality risk are influenced by the order of feature creation. We have Kanban stack ranks in some of our projects to help visualize this. Well, I guess I can see how the order of feature creation could influence project risk. I'm having a little trouble visualizing how it influences quality risk. So obviously, if you got a lot of dependencies between related user stories, then I can see how that would create some project risks of, you implement things in the wrong order, and then you've got something which is implemented, but we're not able to test it because, say, the user interface isn't available. The feature is there, but the user interface is part of another user story, and so the feature exists but can't be tested. That would be a project risk, and just I'm having a little difficulty seeing how it changes quality risk. Maybe you can follow up, Bill, and give an additional suggestion on that. One person mentioned that they lost sound and had to log out and come back in. It only got that feedback from one person, so apparently it was not a systemic thing. So Stefan says, assessing risk is meaningless for regression testing as all tests are typically run by CI tools each night. So it means risk is assessed for new features or user stories. In that case, impact is usually easier to assess than the technical risk. Are there some good practices or good ways to assess technical risks? So when I was talking about assessing risk from the regression testing point of view, I would agree that the order in which the tests are run in the regression suite is probably meaningless in the sense that as long as they all get run overnight, then who cares, right? Now, you still have to figure out how much testing you need to do. So that there is an assessment, there is a risk assessment involved in the sense of going, well, how much testing do I need to have in my continuous integration suite? And it's usually not a good idea just to say, I'm going to automate every test and throw it in the CI automated test bucket and then rerun that every time I rerun it. With our clients that have tried to do that have found fairly quickly that you get to have you get to a large number of regression tests. You start to have some significant issues related to false positives. In other words, tests that fail even though there's not actually a problem with the software, some other issue that's come up that needs to be addressed. You can start to run into test maintenance problems. The value of a test, the value of running an automated test can be less than zero. The cost of running an automated test is never less than zero. It's always greater than zero. And so, you have to evaluate from a risk point of view of, is the risk mitigation that I'm going to get out of this automated regression test worth what ultimately it's going to cost to have it in there? So I would say that there is value in doing that assessment, doing a risk assessment. But I think what you're saying here, you're talking about technical risk. I think you're talking about the likelihood of failure of a regression test, level of technical risk associated with a regression test. And that's going to change as time goes on. And one of the things that it makes sense to do is to look at your regression test results over time and prune those tests. So, if there are tests where apparently the technical risk is very low because they never fail, then you have to look at it and go, okay, well, if this is a high enough impact, it's worth keeping the test even though it never fails. But if it's not a very high impact risk item associated with this, maybe we want to prune this out. So, having some sort of assessment of the level of likelihood and impact associated with the regression tests and periodically evaluating that and trimming those, pruning those tests out, some of those tests out as they get less and less worth doing is definitely a good practice. Because I was just talking to a couple people last week that were struggling with this very problem of, we've accumulated a bunch of automated regression tests and we're getting to the point where it's starting to overwhelm us. Let's see. Jonathan says, what foundational skill set do you think helps young QA analysts become better at risk analysis? Black box techniques, test plan documentation, defect management. Thanks. Well, I think you really need to be, if you're a tester. So I think this gets to the issue that I was talking about with this slide here. So I've got testers now who are used to being just individual contributors, not used to driving these kind of typical traditional test manager tasks, like doing quality risk analysis, like devising a test plan, which is a whole different discussion about test plans in Agile, estimation, all of these kinds of things. So you're basically putting your finger on an issue, a larger issue, which is Agile teams are supposed to be self-directed and self-organized, right? So this means that a lot of stuff that would typically be done by a manager in a traditional lifecycle model, or either development manager or test manager, is now getting pushed down to the individual contributor level. So, really, Jonathan, what you have to do is educate the individual testers in test management skills, because that's what they're going to have to know. In order to be effective as a tester in an Agile team, you can't just go running to the test manager every time something comes up that requires some amount of management thinking. That's going to overwhelm the test manager, and it also is contrary to the whole concept of the self-directed and self-organizing team. So, certainly the kind of test management skills that are discussed in the ISTQB Foundation level is absolutely necessary. But I would say, probably want to take that up to the next level of the advanced test manager, becomes appropriate, or, the kind of techniques that the kind of management techniques that I discussed in my book, Managing the Testing Process. I mean, people need to be aware of that. Individual testers need to be aware of that. So it puts the individual tester in a much more interesting spot in being an Agile, in the sense that they not only do they have to become more savvy with respect to test management techniques, because they're effectively playing that role within the Agile team, but also there's generally a need for them to become more technical than they perhaps were in the past. So being able to ideally read the code that the programmers are writing the product in, being able to advise the programmers on things like code coverage tools and level of code coverage being achieved and what that means. Participating in a lot of automation activities. And there's a lot of technical skills that are needed in addition. So, this tends to, transition to Agile tends to really challenge the testers' skill needs, and the test manager's ability to grow the team into that. Into those skills, also very much challenged. And one of our clients even renamed their test managers as coaches in this situation, because what they found was that so much of the traditional test management activities, so many of those had devolved down into the individual contributors. That what the test managers really had to do was be there, helping them, teaching them, coaching them on all of these new things that they had to be able to do. Thomas asks, I've never heard of planning poker. Could you explain it in a bit more detail? Okay, so planning poker is a implementation of something that's called the Delphic Oracle estimation technique. So in the Delphic Oracle estimation technique, what happens is that let's say that we're going to go through and we're going to estimate a bunch of tasks on a project. It's letting aside what the project is, what the tasks are, but we've got tasks. We want to estimate those. We have a group of people who have the appropriate experience to do the estimation. They're going to be involved in doing the project. We want to tap their collective wisdom and experience to come up with the estimate. Now, so one of the things we could do is just do an open-ended brainstorming session where we put up task and go, all right, so how long do we think this is going to take? And everybody just kind of shouts out their thoughts. The problem with that is that when people do that, they just shout out their thoughts. The first person to say what they think, that number, it's 25 person hours. That number becomes what's called an anchor. So you have it's referred to as an anchoring problem. Basically, then from then on, for the rest of the discussion about that task, everybody's going to be reacting to the 25 person hour number. To avoid that, what you do in Delphic Oracle estimation is that people are asked to estimate the tasks, but they're asked to write them down on a piece of paper, and they don't show that to anybody. And then once everybody has finished doing that, you have a point where everybody reveals their number to everybody else. And if they all agree, then okay, fine, we use that number. If there are disagreements, then what you do is you identify the person who's the high estimator, the one who thinks it's going to take the longest, and the person who's the low estimator, the one who thinks it's going to take the shortest amount of time, and you ask each of them to explain their reasoning. Having done that, you then go through this process again. So again, everybody estimates, write it down. You do another reveal, potentially do another round of, the high and low estimators explaining, and if there's no agreement, and then you'll try it a third time. Usually that's where it's cut off. So after the third time, if you don't have convergence, then you have some way of tie breaking. There are different rules for that. You can use the average. You can use the median. You can use the mode. So there are different suggestions for that. Now, so basically, planning poker is Delphic Oracle estimation, but the term planning poker, I believe, came from a guy named Mike Cohen, who is an Agile consultant. And if you go to his website, Mountain Goat Software, all one word, you can find out more about his particular implementation of it, and he's got even playing cards and so forth to be used to do this. But you don't have to do anything more sophisticated than what I just described. There are various ways that people go about doing this estimation. It can be done just using traditional person hours, and we have plenty of clients that do that. Cohen on his website talks about something called story points, which are relative sizes using a Fibonacci series. We've got one or two clients that have done that. You can go at it either way, and either way you can use the story points or the person hours to establish what your velocity, actually is, what you can actually get through. And again, so if you want to see more about planning poker as envisioned, by Mike Cohen, just go out to Mountain Goat Software and take a look at that. Maria says unexpected changes are the most significant contributor to finding high risks. But Agile says that we should be flexible to changes. So how do you balance that flexibility with the risk communication and plan mitigations? Well, if you are in the middle of an iteration and there's a significant change that is, dropped effectively out of nowhere on a particular user story, that's obviously going to be very disruptive. You'll have to go back. You'll have to reassess the likelihood and impact based on the change. That could result in some fairly significant twiddling of the user story, of the risk analysis and of the resulting testing. Now, again, Scrum theory. I mean, if you read Schwaber's book on Scrum, he says basically that shouldn't happen. That once the content of an iteration is determined, that the user stories should not be changed. You shouldn't add new user stories and significantly modify the user stories that were already selected. Our experience with our clients is that, yeah, they do change that. So, mostly it's a matter of, making sure that you are included in these discussions about proposed changes during the sprints, so that you're not blindsided by it, and B, that the decision about what changes to make be based in part on what's the level of risk, quality risk associated with that, and how disruptive is that to the testing effort. So, you want to really push to make sure that you've got that level of involvement. Let's see. Alexander asks, if there is a risk analysis added at the beginning of an iteration, how much time should be estimated for this process of risk analysis per sprint? How to estimate this time? It's a minor incremental addition. You're already going to be going through the user stories anyway at the beginning of the sprints. And you're going to be refining the user stories, defining acceptance criteria. So, this is an incremental addition. I would say, if this adds another hour, maybe 2 hours maximum, but probably more like an hour. So really, if it's adding too much time, I would guess that what's happening is you're getting hung up on either arguments about whether something is or is not a risk, in which case you need to get people better educated on how to identify quality risk items, or you're having trouble getting agreement on likelihood and impact ratings, in which case you have a problem with your criteria and they need to be refined. Mary says, is the webinar available for free replay on your site? Yes, it's in the digital library. We record all of these webinars, and they are posted on the digital library. So if you go to the resources tab, the center of the upper center of the home page, and navigate from there to the digital library, you'll find this. It's usually posted within about a week. Jan asks, what is the main difference or main different activities between the risk-based testing and waterfall and agile testing? Basically, the main difference is just that in traditional waterfall life cycles, we do a big upfront risk analysis in parallel with the planning and requirement specification phases, and then periodically adjust that as the project continues. And in Agile, we do a high-level risk analysis during release planning, and the specific risk items are identified repeatedly at the beginning of each iteration. Nikos asks, Rex, could you give some hints about the estimation methods used in Agile testing projects? Thanks in advance. Nikos, I think what I want to do with this request is punt on it. Hopefully you'll be able to attend the December webinar where I'm talking about estimation, and we can get into this in a lot more detail there. I just can't, in the 6 minutes we've got left, I can't give you an answer that's anywhere worth listening to. Belina says, I had to drop due to no sound and join again. I assume it will count me. Yeah, hopefully it shows you as an attendee, even though you did drop off. We'll work that out if it didn't. Let's see. Miko says, you say that risk-based testing is a long-proven testing best practice. Are there any studies supporting this claim, or is this statement based on your own experience? By the way, I'm a big fan of risk-based testing. Studies. I'm trying to think if this is one of these things that Capers-Jones has looked at or not, whether he's done any analysis of it. The claim that I'm making is it's based on my own experience. Again, as I said, I've been doing this for about 20 years now. I've probably trained personally or through my company and or partners, probably trained in excess of 10,000 people in the technique, I would guess. And I've worked directly with clients to help them implement this technique, well over a dozen clients to, help them launch it. I actually been involved in successful pilot efforts with them. I've done it myself on a number of projects. So, yeah, my own experience, and also I've talked to other people who are effectively competitors of mine, who have somewhat different techniques that they've developed, but techniques that are very similar, and they've used them successfully with a large number of clients. Just recently, a company called Test Leaders developed a tool that they're apparently selling like hotcakes that is effectively an implementation of the technique that I just described. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's anecdotal, but there's a lot of anecdotes. But as far as like industry studies, like something like Capers-Jones going out and doing analysis of, what percentage of organizations have successfully implemented risk-based testing versus how many tried to implement it and failed, and of those who failed, did it fail because of the way they implemented it, or did it fail because it just didn't give them any value? That's something that somebody else would have to look at. Antonio asks, how do we implement risk-based testing techniques in an environment where most of the testing resources are crowdsourced and planning time is very limited? I'll be frank with you, I don't know. I'm not sure how exactly you would do that. One of the problems with distributed testing can be centralized in a way that allows you to do risk-based testing and distributed testing or distributed situations. But what you're describing here goes beyond that. We're getting into a situation where there's minimal planning, minimal direct control. So I honestly don't know how you would go about doing it. This could be one of the weaknesses of this. I mean, there was a famous quote from one of the founding fathers, or maybe not founding fathers, a kind of thought leader, or at least big talking head. I forget his name, of open source. And he said, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, which sounds like a profound statement. But that's like saying that if you take enough shotgun blasts at a piece of cardboard, eventually you'll completely blow out all of the cardboard. And I would say, well, yeah, okay, but, assuming there's a target painted on that cardboard, my goal is not to blow out the entire piece of cardboard. My goal is to put holes right in the center of the target, right? So that's one of the ways that I've explained this to clients before, is that, these kind of just brute force approaches to testing throw a hell of a lot of resources at it. It's like, using a machine gun or a shotgun where what you really want to do is use a sniper rifle, right? And, put targeted holes exactly where you want to put holes rather than just blasting away at things. So, I don't really know what to say, like how you would go about doing it. Excuse me. Maria asks, if an Agile team never worked with formal risk-based testing to start its implementation, could it be an option to start the risk analysis and the release planning, high level, and then once the team is more mature, move to the iteration planning? Well, that's certainly what you would do, yeah, but what I'm suggesting is that you want to do both. You want to do risk analysis during the release planning at a high level, and then do the more detailed in each iteration plan. I really don't think this technique is not that hard to use. I mean, I've gotten organizations started doing risk-based testing in a week. So, if you want to go that route, it's not a very expensive consulting engagement, but if you've got no money, then there's, like I said, tons of resources out on the RBCS website for free, videos and other kinds of resources that you can look at. So, you should be able to get people to do it. I mean, the thing I worry about with what you're suggesting, Maria, is that I think you would get very little value out of the analysis done in the release planning, and thus you'd never get to the point where people rolled it out to the iteration planning, because the real value is going to come out of doing it at the iteration level. And it's important to keep stakeholders engaged, and the way you're going to do that is by showing them value. And if you don't have any value to show them, this process is going to die. Mary says, for Agile projects and risk-based testing, what challenges do you see with one individual performing tester and test manager role? I think I addressed this, Mary, with respect to Jonathan's question earlier. You asked this question about 5 minutes or 10 minutes before I answered Jonathan's question, so I think I've covered that. Let's see. Terry asks, at the beginning of the session, you stated the presentation is or is not available. Yeah, it's available on the basic library. The slides are, and as I said before, the recorded presentation will be posted. Let's see. I got a question from Irene here, which I think is going to have to be the last question. She says, I'm participating in an Agile-like project, and what we are supposed to do at the moment is a TSA support during unit testing. Later on, we will proceed with the full FST, assuming that's functional system test. I do not know what TSA support. FST testing, functional system testing, and end-to-end testing. What would be the best approach to make sure that what was tested in unit is secured and parked? Do you think we have to retest unit tested items in the functional system test? Thanks. Well, I'm assuming that you're talking about that the testing is going to happen within the sprints and be focused on the individual items, and then later after the sprints, you're going to go into more of a full-blown end-to-end system integration, system test type of approach. Some people make fun of this and call this Scrummer fall, with a waterfall piece at the end prior to release and hardening sprints and so forth. Now, in terms of do we have to retest? Well, okay, so there's regression testing, and you want to have a lot of automated regression test support available for you in this process, because it's inherently, there's a lot of regression risk in Agile. But that stuff should be very inexpensive to retest. The question of do we have to go back and do things over again? Well, no. I mean, if you're doing risk-based testing, if you feel like a particular risk from a new development point of view has been adequately mitigated, then it's been adequately mitigated. This is one of the advantages of risk-based testing. If you use it to coordinate all of your testing, is that you won't have to necessarily repeat things. So we've run a little long. Thank you for all of your interesting questions. Now, to close this session, a little bit more about the resources that are available. We run these free webinar sessions once a month. Check our website, rbcs-us.com, to sign up. If you want a special webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or on any other topic, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com or contact us via our website. On our website, you can sign up for our regular free newsletter, which will give you valuable discounts on our services, along with regular newsletter that includes a featured article on software testing and quality and news about what RBCS and its partners are doing. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at RBCS, and on Facebook, we are RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple of days. You could be the lucky winner of a free e-learning course from RBCS, and you were registered simply by attending this free event. As I said, check out the basic, advanced, and digital libraries. We have templates and articles and recordings of these webinars out there. You can also subscribe to the RBCS channel on YouTube to see these recorded webinars when they come out. We offer these free resources as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. Concludes the webinar. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on future webinars.